A proud black farmer, whose family had worked the same fertile fields for generations, woke up one morning to find bulldozers tearing through his land. A runway, built without warning, cut across the heart of his crops, leaving destruction in its path. Neighbors watched, some shouting, some silent, as officials stood by and did nothing. But what no one knew was that this man wasn't powerless, and his fight would shake the very system that tried to silence him.
Before the noise of bulldozers, before the chaos of flashing lights and raised voices, there was peace. For years, Samuel Carter's life had been woven into the soil of his family farm. Every sunrise greeted him with rows of green crops glistening under dew, and every sunset left him standing at the edge of his fields, proud of the work his hands had shaped. Farming wasn't just a career to Samuel, it was legacy. His grandfather had tilled this same earth after escaping the chains of sharecropping. His father had built a home here, raising Samuel with the values of discipline, resilience, and faith in hard work. And now Samuel carried that torch forward, determined to preserve both the land and the story it held. Neighbors often saw him in the early mornings, leaning on his shovel, greeting everyone with a nod. Children from nearby homes would wave as he loaded fresh produce onto his truck to take to the local market. To them, Samuel wasn't just another farmer. He was a symbol of stability, someone who made the community feel rooted. His land wasn't sprawling with wealth or luxury, but it carried history, dignity, and a quiet kind of power. Samuel's days followed a steady rhythm. He'd rise before dawn, walk the boundaries of his fields, check the irrigation, and tend to the crops. By noon, he would meet with local buyers who trusted his reputation for quality. On weekends, he opened his land for school visits, teaching children where their food came from. In a world spinning with noise and speed, his farm was a sanctuary of patience and persistence. But beneath this serenity, something darker was stirring. A handful of new homeowners, wealthy and self-important, had begun pushing into the community. They formed a homeowners association, an HOA, that believed Samuel's farm didn't fit their vision of progress. They wanted more development, more projects, more convenience for themselves. To them, his land wasn't history, it was an obstacle. At first, the whispers felt distant. He heard rumors that the HOA had been eyeing his fields for a new project. Some said it was for luxury housing, others for commercial space. He brushed it off, trusting that the law and his ownership would protect him. After all, the farm had been registered in his family's name for generations. What power could a group of neighbors really hold against that? Still, unease crept in. He noticed strangers surveying the edges of his property, jotting notes into clipboards, as though measuring land that wasn't theirs. Flyers appeared at community meetings, painting the farm as underutilized space that could be repurposed for the good of all residents. Samuel's stomach turned whenever he read those words. Repurposed? His life's work, his family's roots, spoken of as though they were disposable? And then there were the stares. At gatherings, Samuel could feel the weight of eyes on him, not of admiration, but of calculation, as if they were already planning how to erase him. The farm, to the HOA, was nothing more than land, but to Samuel, it was a lifeline, a heritage, a reminder that his family had fought too hard to claim a place in a world that once denied them everything. The tension grew quietly, almost invisibly, like a storm gathering on the horizon. No one could predict how violent the winds would become, but the clouds were forming, and Samuel, though steady in his work and proud in his roots, was about to be tested in ways that would shake not just his farm, but the very foundation of what justice means. Because the HOA wasn't just planning another neighborhood project, they were preparing to carve something far larger, far louder, and far more destructive right through the heart of his land. And Samuel, unknowingly, was standing on the edge of a battle that would expose not only greed, but something far uglier: racism hidden beneath polished smiles and paper contracts.
It started subtly, almost like a shadow creeping across the fields. Samuel noticed the first real sign when trucks began parking along the edge of his property. Men in hard hats got out, surveying equipment slung over their shoulders, orange flags marking the ground where his crops had grown tall for decades. When he approached them, they spoke in clipped tones, refusing to answer who had sent them. Instead, they pointed vaguely to the HOA and muttered about progress before driving off. Within days, the quiet hum of farm life was drowned by the growl of machinery. Bulldozers, road rollers, and backhoes arrived, tearing into the soil as if it had never belonged to anyone. Crops were flattened, fences ripped from the earth, and the once carefully nurtured rows of green were reduced to mud and rubble. Samuel stood frozen, his heart pounding, watching as generations of labor were erased in a matter of hours. He demanded answers, but the HOA dismissed his concerns with cold efficiency. "This project is approved," they told him, waving papers Samuel had never seen before. The signatures were there, the permit stamped, but Samuel knew something was wrong. His consent was nowhere on those documents. His land deed, his rights, his history, all of it had been bypassed as though his existence didn't matter. The insult cut deeper than the bulldozers themselves, because Samuel knew why this was happening. He had seen the way certain board members looked at him, the way they spoke about his farm as blight or wasted space. And now, with a runway being carved through his fields, their message was unmistakable. His roots, his heritage, his blackness, none of it was welcome here. The community reacted with uneasy silence. Some whispered their sympathy, shaking their heads at the injustice, but few spoke up. Fear of the HOA's influence kept neighbors quiet, and those who dared to raise a voice were quickly silenced with threats of fines or legal trouble. Samuel felt the weight of isolation pressing down on him. It wasn't just his farm under attack, it was his dignity, his identity, his right to exist on equal ground. As the construction pushed forward, the true scope of the project revealed itself. This wasn't just a small strip of asphalt. The HOA was building a full runway, complete with lights, markers, and space for private jets, a playground for the wealthy, bought at the cost of a black man's livelihood. Each new day brought more destruction. Barns reduced to piles of wood, irrigation lines snapped in two, and centuries-old trees uprooted like weeds. Samuel tried to fight back. He filed complaints with local officials, submitted his deeds, and pleaded with the council to intervene. But everywhere he turned, doors slammed in his face. It was as if the system had been designed to exhaust him, to grind down his spirit until he had no strength left to resist. And when police officers finally arrived, not to protect him, but to keep the peace during construction, the message was even clearer. They stood on the sidelines, watching as the machines tore through his land, their presence a silent warning that resistance would bring consequences. The injustice became unbearable when Samuel returned one evening to find his home surrounded by construction equipment. His fields, once filled with crops, now bore the scars of tire tracks and half-laid asphalt. The air smelled of diesel, and dust choked the sky. A white woman in a pristine suit, an HOA representative, stood at the center of it all, pointing towards Samuel's property as if directing traffic. Her voice carried above the noise, sharp and commanding, dismissing his protests as though he were invisible. Neighbors gathered at the edge of the road, watching the confrontation unfold. Some looked away in shame, others whispered nervously, but no one intervened.
Samuel felt the crushing realization that he was utterly alone in this fight. His heritage, his livelihood, his dignity, all of it was being bulldozed while the world stood by. And yet, beneath the weight of despair, something inside him refused to break. He remembered his grandfather's calloused hands planting seeds in this same soil, his father's back bent in the sun as he worked the land, his mother's voice reminding him that strength was not just about survival, but about resistance. Samuel knew he could not allow this to be the end of his story. But how could one man stand against an entire system? The HOA had money, power, connections. They had already manipulated the law, turned neighbors into silent witnesses, and enlisted the police as passive enforcers. Samuel's farm seemed lost, swallowed by greed and prejudice. Yet there was something the HOA hadn't considered. Samuel wasn't just a farmer. His life extended beyond the rows of crops and barns. He carried a title that connected him to a power greater than any HOA board. And as the last rays of sunlight glowed over the desecrated land, Samuel began preparing for the moment when he would reveal it. Because the HOA thought they were erasing a farmer, but in reality, they were waging war against the director of the Federal Aviation Administration. And soon, they would learn what it meant to underestimate not just a man, but an entire legacy of resilience that could not be paved over.
The morning the confrontation reached its breaking point, the air carried a strange stillness. Samuel stood at the edge of what had once been his proudest field, now scarred by lines of black asphalt stretching like a wound across the earth. Heavy machinery rumbled, workers in neon vests shouted over each other, and the white-suited HOA representative directed the chaos as if orchestrating a performance. But this was no ordinary construction site anymore. It was the erasure of history in real time. Samuel's boots sank into the dirt as he walked forward, his heart hammering louder than the bulldozers. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of everything he carried. The memories of ancestors who had tilled this land, the injustice of neighbors who had stayed silent, and the deep ache of knowing racism had once again disguised itself as progress. The HOA representative spotted him, her voice sliced through the noise, dripping with disdain. "You need to leave this property. This is no longer your concern." No longer his concern. Those words hit harder than any blow. For generations, his family had nurtured the soil. Every tree cut down, every barn demolished, every crop buried beneath asphalt. It was more than property loss. It was a theft of identity, a declaration that his heritage was disposable. Samuel's chest tightened as he glanced around. Police officers stood at the periphery, arms crossed, their silence deafening. Neighbors gathered again, whispering from a safe distance. Not one stepped forward, not one spoke in his defense. The machines roared back to life, tearing through the earth like predators devouring prey. Samuel felt his legs weaken, as though the weight of generations pressed against him, daring him to stand or crumble. And then, something inside him shifted. He thought of his grandfather's voice telling stories of survival after slavery, of his father who had stood tall in the face of segregation, of every ancestor who had fought so that he could stand here today. He knew this moment wasn't just about a farm. It was about dignity. It was about refusing to be erased. His voice cut across the chaos, strong and unshaken. "This land does not belong to you. You may pave over the soil, but you will not bury me." The workers froze. Even the bulldozers seemed to hesitate. The HOA representative's face twisted with rage, but there was a flicker of something else. Doubt. Because for the first time, Samuel was not pleading. He was declaring. And then, with deliberate calm, he revealed what he had kept hidden until now. He was not just a farmer, not just a man clinging to his land. He was the director of the Federal Aviation Administration.
The words rippled through the crowd like a shockwave. The HOA representative stuttered, her confident posture faltering. Workers exchanged uncertain glances, their hands paused on machinery controls. Even the police officers shifted uneasily, realizing the man they had dismissed as powerless held authority over the very project being forced upon him. Samuel stepped closer, his presence commanding the space. He pointed at the freshly laid asphalt. This runway is illegal. It violates federal aviation law, environmental codes, and property rights. You built this in arrogance, believing you could silence me, but you cannot silence justice. The crowd erupted in whispers. Some neighbors looked stunned, others ashamed. The police officers, once passive, now radioed nervously, unsure of their place in what was unraveling. The HOA's arrogance had reached its peak, and now it was cracking under the weight of truth. The representative tried to regain control. "You can't stop progress," she hissed. But the words rang hollow, because in that moment, progress looked nothing like justice. It looked like theft, arrogance, and racial prejudice exposed for all to see. Samuel's voice rose again, this time carrying the strength of every injustice endured. "You thought my skin made me powerless. You thought my history made me weak. But what you failed to see is that I carry more than myself. I carry a legacy, and that legacy will not be paved over." The silence that followed was thunderous. Workers lowered their tools. The police shifted uneasily, realizing that continuing to ignore the truth could cost them dearly. The HOA's arrogance had reached its peak, and now it was cracking under the weight of truth. But this was only the beginning. Samuel knew exposing them here was not enough. He would take this battle beyond the fields, to the courts, to the agencies, to the very heart of the system that had allowed this injustice to happen. He would not rest until accountability was forced into the light. And yet, the fight ahead was uncertain. Corruption ran deep, and racism had many faces. The path forward would be long, grueling, and lonely. But in this moment, standing firm as machines fell silent around him, Samuel had reclaimed something greater than land. He had reclaimed his voice. And the crowd watched in stunned silence, unsure what would happen next. Would the bulldozers return tomorrow? Would the HOA double down, using their wealth and power to crush him in court? Or had Samuel just ignited a spark that could not be extinguished? The answer hung heavy in the air, unresolved. Because when injustice is exposed, it doesn't end. It transforms. It grows louder, spreads wider, and demands to be answered. And as Samuel turned his gaze to the horizon, the question lingered for everyone watching. Was this the moment the fight for one man's land became the fight for justice everywhere?
The courtroom finally fell silent. The gavel struck once, echoing like thunder in the hearts of everyone present. Justice, though delayed, had found its voice. The officer who once laughed while humiliating Marcus was no longer untouchable. For the first time in months, Marcus felt the weight on his chest lift, not completely, but enough to let him breathe again. But healing isn't instant. When Marcus stepped outside, he looked at the crowd gathered, some cheering, others silent, all watching. His victory wasn't just his, it belonged to every face in that crowd who had once been told they didn't belong. Every child who had been taught to fear instead of dream. Every mother who prayed her son would come home safe at night. Still, Marcus couldn't escape one haunting thought. Why did it take so much pain, so much struggle, just to be treated as human? That question lingered like smoke in the air, because the truth is, this wasn't just Marcus's story, it's the story of countless others who never see justice. For every Marcus who rises, there are voices still silenced, names we may never know, lives that end without the world ever hearing their cries. And yet in Marcus's eyes burned a fire, a promise that he would use his voice, his story, to push back against the silence. He knew the fight was bigger than him, But he also knew that silence only protects the oppressor, never the oppressed. So here's the question we must ask ourselves: how many more Marcuses will it take before we change? The answer lies not in the hands of fate, but in ours, in the choices we make, in the courage we show, in whether we dare to stand when others sit, to speak when others whisper, to fight when it would be easier to turn away. Because racism doesn't end when a gavel falls. It ends when we choose, every single day, to tear it out at the roots. So, I ask you, will you be part of that choice? Or will you let another Marcus carry the weight alone?